You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Very late one night in 2004, a woman in Connecticut pulled into the driveway of a house that had just been put on the market for rent. She didn't know if the owner was home or not, but she figured even if they were, they probably wouldn't care if she just quickly walked around the outside of their property and then left. So, after turning her car off, she hopped out of the vehicle and began walking down the driveway toward the dark backyard. But before getting there, she stopped because something on the ground was staring up at her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to be the 5-star review button's assistant as they fix their car troubles, but do not hold the flashlight steady. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was early March 2004, and Dr. Eugene Malov was a man who had just received very good news. As the scientist headed from his home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, to his small publishing company located just 7 miles away in Concord, he looked out the window of his dark green Dodge Caravan minivan. The narrow local road that would take him to Route 3 and then north to the state's picturesque capital was hemmed in on both sides by a thick border of trees. No matter how many times Eugene made this drive, he was always struck by the natural beauty that surrounded him. And now, as he looked at the postcard perfection of the New Hampshire mountains, forests, and rushing streams, he suddenly felt hopeful that the research he was doing would help preserve the beauty of this environment for generations to come. If his 2 children and his brand new first grandchild were going to enjoy the cool summers and clean air that he'd grown up with, then the United States and the world had to find a power source that was cleaner, cheaper, and safer than burning natural gas or fossil fuels. And Eugene, along with a small handful of other scientists, was absolutely positive that he already knew what that power source was: cold fusion. Also known as low-level nuclear reaction, cold fusion is a revolutionary way to create unlimited energy by forcing a nuclear reaction to take place at room temperature and under normal pressure. It's actually the same kind of reaction that triggers the energy released by the explosion of an atomic bomb. The very good news that Eugene had read that morning was in an email from a high-profile science writer saying that the U.S. Department of Energy had finally agreed to review all the research and evidence supporting cold fusion as a viable energy alternative that should be funded and studied at the government level. Although the upcoming review was not yet public knowledge, Eugene knew that the implications were potentially huge, because up to that point, cold fusion was mostly ridiculed as being a foolish idea straight out of a science fiction novel. But now, if the government stamped their approval on cold fusion, it would totally disrupt the world energy production industry. And more specifically, it would cost jobs and money for a lot of people who worked or invested in fossil fuels. The concept of cold fusion had first made public headlines back in 1989 when 2 electrochemists working at the University of Utah claimed to have discovered the chemical process that led to cold fusion. And for a while, it was the breakthrough in energy research that everyone, including Eugene, was buzzing about. But when no one else could replicate the scientists' results, it didn't take long before people began accusing the electrochemists of faking their results, that cold fusion was just a hoax. But over the years, after reviewing all the science and data, Eugene had gone from being a member of the mainstream cold fusion skeptics club to conducting his own experiments and research that convinced him that cold fusion was possible. In fact, as far as Eugene was concerned, cold fusion was not just a theory. It was a scientific certainty that would transform people's lives and save the planet from global warming. And, especially with the U.S. Department of Energy review adding to his credibility, Eugene knew that he had the brilliance and academic pedigree to totally back up his claim that cold fusion was not just a crazy pipe dream. Back when he was just 23 years old, Eugene had earned both an undergraduate and advanced degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This college, which is known more commonly by its acronym MIT, is one of the top science universities in the world. 5 years later, he'd graduate from Harvard, another top-ranked university also located in Cambridge, Mass., with a doctorate in environmental health sciences. But to his friends and his family, Eugene had never been known as a straight-laced, boring academic. While he did love to talk endlessly about his latest experiments in global warming and cold fusion, he also had a totally zany sense of humor and a big personality to boot that often made him the life of any party he attended. Eugene's interest in science extended far beyond the laboratory. He didn't just research the development of new energies, he wrote about the futuristic ways they could be applied. When he was 34, he co-authored a paper about using solar sails to travel to Alpha Centauri, the star closest to the Sun. And as a science journalism teacher at both MIT and Boston University, Eugene was popular for his ability to teach students how to turn dry, technical, and scientific findings into language that could capture the public's interest and imagination. In fact, in 1987, because of his acclaim as a scientist who was also a gifted writer, MIT offered Eugene the job of becoming the university's national and local media contact for MIT research, and the chief science writer and director in charge of reporting on all MIT research for the MIT University newspaper, Tech Talk. And during all that time, Eugene continued focusing his energy and genius on what had become his personal crusade, exploring and understanding cold fusion. So 4 years later, in 1991, it did not come as a big surprise to his fellow scientists and colleagues when Eugene published a book on cold fusion that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, one of the most coveted awards in literature. What did surprise the scientific community was Eugene's decision, also in 1991, to resign from his high-paying job at MIT and to accuse the prestigious university of deliberately hiding cold fusion data so it could protect its reputation and its funding for more conventional nuclear fusion research. After leaving MIT, Eugene totally embraced his new role as an outsider, a highly respected and credentialed scientist and writer who challenged his more traditional and mainstream colleagues to push the limits of invention and theory. He began working as a consultant to U.S. corporations and investment firms doing research and development in cold fusion. In late 1994, he founded his own magazine called Infinite Energy, and with the money from an anonymous donor, he also set up his own nonprofit organization called New Energy Foundation that built a laboratory for testing new technologies. In 1998, Eugene was the technical advisor for the Hollywood thriller The Saint that centers around the theft of a newly discovered formula for cold fusion. Now, in 2004, as Eugene drove along the beautiful New Hampshire country roads, he was known not only for his brilliance and unconventional career path, but for his outspoken and sometimes combative criticism of big oil and the mainstream energy science community. As Eugene turned right onto New Hampshire Route 3, the narrow highway that would take him the rest of the way to his office in Concord, he'd already decided on the headline for the article he'd be writing for the May-June issue of his magazine, Infinite Energy. It would read, U.S. Department of Energy commits to re-examine cold fusion, 15 years of evidence for low-energy nuclear reactions. After pulling into a parking space out front of his magazine headquarters, Eugene hopped out of his car and headed inside where he celebrated this victory with his little 4-person staff. Over the next few weeks, Eugene put off everything else in his life so he could work exclusively on the article for the next issue of Infinite Energy. And only when it was finished did he really turn his attention to another, totally separate, personal problem that had been coming to a head over the last several months. Back in the spring of 2003, a little more than 1 year before the review of cold fusion was announced, Eugene's parents were ready to sell their house in Norwich, Connecticut, where Eugene had grown up. Eugene's dad had been a plumber, and his mom had been a math teacher, and then once they retired, they moved away from Norwich. And for more than a year, the white craftsman-style home on Salem Turnpike in the middle of the old mill town in eastern Connecticut had been sitting vacant. But Eugene, who was an only child, had very fond memories of the house with its arched windows and doorway. He'd spent hours when he was young lying out in the backyard of that house, looking up at the stars while he imagined scenes from the hundreds of science fiction books he loved to read. So he persuaded his parents not to sell the property, but to rent it out instead. This way, they could keep the place that held so many happy memories, and Eugene, who said he would manage the property for a small fee, could pull in some much-needed extra income. Ever since Eugene had left his high-paying job at MIT to focus on his magazine and foundation, money had become tight, especially in the last year when his fundraising efforts had fallen short and he'd been forced to shut down the research lab at Infinite Energy and lay off 3 of his lab technicians. Eugene had even gotten his own real estate license to help cover family expenses and keep his magazine afloat, but it still just wasn't really enough. And so this rental property opportunity was a lot more than just nostalgia. This was a big financial opportunity for Eugene and his wife of 34 years, Joanne. So in May of 2003, Eugene's first tenants at his family's home moved in, Patricia and Roy Anderson. And at first, everything was great. Then, in January and February of 2004, the couple missed paying their rent. As a licensed real estate broker, Eugene knew that he could have started eviction proceedings within 2 weeks of non-payment. But Eugene and his parents did not want to just kick the couple and their 26-year-old son off the property unless that was their absolute only option. But after months of sending the tenants dozens of legal notices that rent was due and never hearing a word back, the matter unfortunately went to mediation, which is when a neutral third party steps in and helps the 2 sides resolve their issues. Eugene and the tenants would eventually work out an agreement that gave the Andersons until mid-April 2004 to move out of the house. And, true to their word, the Andersons would leave on time, and they would move into a new apartment about 20 minutes away. But despite getting the property back, Eugene knew that it was not ready to be rented out again. Soon, he would have to get over there and make some repairs and do some lawn work and remove some belongings that the Andersons appeared to have just left behind. But for now, with the May-June issue of Infinite Energy finally out on the newsstands, Eugene, who had not had a day off in weeks, decided to take a little break from his responsibilities. So he and Joanne arranged to take a short vacation and go to Seattle, Washington to visit their newly born first grandchild. This flexibility was one of the things that Eugene had enjoyed the most since leaving MIT. He missed the big paycheck, but really, Eugene had never been much of a 9-to-5 company man. Still strong and in good shape, with receding but still thick dark hair, a graying beard, and glasses, Eugene threw himself into physical work and social get-togethers with the same energy that he brought to conducting cold fusion experiments in the basement of his New Hampshire home. His wife, Joanne, was just as outgoing and sociable as her husband, so they were both excited about seeing their daughter and son-in-law, meeting the new grandbaby, and exploring the largest city in the Pacific Northwest. And once there, everyone knew that Eugene would spend at least a few hours in various Seattle coffee shops chatting with environmentally conscious hipsters about global warming. Before leaving for Seattle, Eugene had emailed his colleagues in the scientific community about the pending Department of Energy review of cold fusion, and he urged them to make the potential role for cold fusion a key issue in the 2004 presidential campaign that was now underway. It was clear Eugene wanted to rattle a few cages amongst the cold fusion skeptics. After returning a few days later from Seattle, all Eugene really wanted to do was dive right back into his cold fusion research. But before he could do that, he knew he had to head back down to Connecticut and prep the family property so it could be rented out again. So, bright and early on Friday, May 14th, 2004, Eugene put on his khaki work pants and white t-shirt. He hopped into his Dodge Caravan, decorated with cold fusion decals, and made the 2.5-hour drive south to begin the big cleanup. Eugene liked physical work, and he was actually looking forward to getting the property back in shape. The mediation/eviction process had been quite stressful, and it had cost him some money, but in the end, both he and the Andersons had actually parted on good terms. When Eugene arrived at 119 Salem Turnpike, he felt a familiar sense of affection for the place where he had grown up. The house was set close to the road, and the road was now a lot busier since he was a kid. And then as he kind of looked around, he felt a little pang of regret that so many of the houses on the block that he had grown up with had given way to fast food restaurants and shabby strip malls. There were some big trees on the Malov property, and their driveway extended from Salem Turnpike straight back to a detached two-car garage and back. Once in the backyard, the house itself blocked the view of the street and muffled the sound of traffic. It was actually one of the property's best selling points, that the backyard felt much more private than the location of the house suggested. Eugene turned his car into the driveway and drove down it until he came to a stop right in front of a big green dumpster that he had rented that was positioned right outside of the garage. After getting out of his car, Eugene walked over to the back door of the house, he unlocked it, and went inside to use the first-floor bathroom. Afterwards, he went back outside, tossed his empty coffee cup into the dumpster, and then he made his way into the detached garage to start clearing it out. Over the next couple of hours, Eugene threw a lot of the junk in the garage out into the dumpster, he cut the grass, and he got a chance to chat with the next-door neighbors and put out the word that, yes, they were looking for some new tenants. Eventually, Eugene went back inside of the house and began removing some of the random possessions that the Andersons had left behind. By mid-afternoon, Eugene had called his wife, Joanne, to let her know that he was making good progress, but there was still a lot to do, and so he probably would not be back until at least 9 p.m. It was late afternoon when Eugene, who was working in the back of the house by this point, heard a car pull into the driveway. From where he was standing, he couldn't see the car because the house was blocking his view, so he just stopped what he was doing and listened for a second. A second later, Eugene heard two car doors open and then slam shut in the driveway. Eugene likely believed these were people who had maybe seen his for rent sign, which was out front, and they were just looking for more information about the property. So Eugene made the short walk from behind the house over to the driveway, and when he turned the corner and looked up the driveway toward this new parked car, he had to squint because the sun was beaming down on his face. As he strained his eyes to see who was there, he made out two large men he did not recognize walking toward him. Before Eugene could even ask their names or what they wanted, the two men rushed up to him and began kind of muscling him backwards. As they did this, they told Eugene very clearly why they were there, at which point Eugene, who's kind of stumbling backwards, began yelling for them to stop and to just leave, but the two men did not leave. Instead, they continued to press and muscle him backwards until Eugene was out of sight of the driveway and the main road. Several hours later, at around 10 p.m., Eugene's wife, Joanne, who was at their home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, 2.5 hours away to the north, received a call from a woman who identified herself as Demetris Granger. The woman was down in Norwich, Connecticut, and while driving along the Salem Turnpike, she'd seen a house with a for rent sign out front, and she called the number, which was Joanne's phone number. She apologized for the late call, but she wanted to know if it was possible to maybe have a look at the property that night. Joanne had not heard from Eugene since their last call several hours earlier, and since he wasn't back yet, she had just assumed he was still at the house working. So she gave Demetris a description of her husband and his vehicle and told her that if Eugene was still there, she was sure he'd be happy to show her around. About 40 minutes later, Demetris arrived outside of 119 Salem Turnpike. She didn't see a Dodge Caravan in the driveway, and so she figured Eugene must have left to go back to New Hampshire. But she decided, since she was there, she would still like to just hop out and maybe get a better look at the outside of the property. So she pulled into the driveway, she parked her car, and she got out and began walking down the driveway toward the back of the house. But after walking only a few steps, she suddenly stopped. Then, with her hands shaking, she pulled out her cell phone and she dialed 911. This podcast is at the Norwich Police Department, just 7 minutes away from the rental property. The night dispatcher answered the emergency call. Demetris told them she was at 119 Salem Turnpike and that she was looking down at the mangled body of a man lying face up in a pool of blood on the driveway. By 11 p.m. that night, Eugene's childhood home was swarming with police and emergency medical personnel. It didn't take long for the two lead detectives who arrived on the scene to realize that they were likely dealing with a homicide and a possible robbery. As they approached the victim, they immediately noted that his shoes were gone and his pockets had been pulled inside out. After talking with a terrified Demetris, who had gone back to sit inside of her car, and after dialing the phone number listed on the for rent sign out in the front yard, it also didn't take the detectives very long to identify the victim as Eugene Malov. Joanne Malov, almost speechless with shock, was able to tell detectives that her husband was in Norwich to clean up the family rental property. She told them that she had expected Eugene home in New Hampshire by now, but she had talked with him earlier in the afternoon by phone, and he had told her that there was just a lot of work to do and that he might be much later than he had thought. When police told her that his van was not in the driveway, Joanne suddenly spoke in a rush and said, "Well, are you sure the body is his? Maybe he already left, and the person you're telling me that's dead, maybe that's not him." But, as gently as they could, the detectives on the phone told Joanne that the man they had found definitely matched her husband's description. Then, the Norwich police called the Pembroke, New Hampshire police and asked them to send an officer over to the Malov house to check on Joanne and to gather any information they could about her husband's activities that day. The Norwich police also put out a be on the lookout, or BOLO, alert for Eugene's car with its distinctive decals and vanity license plate. The crime scene itself was a mess, in part because the yard and driveway were covered with fresh grass clippings as well as litter and debris from the ongoing cleanout of the property. Based on everything they saw, the theory the police came up with was that Eugene had been the victim of a robbery and that after killing him, his attacker had taken Eugene's watch and wallet, removed his shoes, and then fled in Eugene's van. Early the next morning, Norwich police got a call from a patrol officer saying he'd discovered Eugene's Dodge Caravan in a commuter parking lot at the Foxwoods Resort and Casino, located 15 minutes away from the site of the murder. A forensic examination of the vehicle showed no signs of any fingerprints on the steering wheel or on the car door handles. The engine and exhaust pipe were cool to the touch when the car was found, so police knew it had not been driven recently and was probably left there immediately after the murder. Security cameras at Foxwoods didn't help either. The night had been cloudy, damp, and hazy, and there was no footage that showed the vehicle or its driver entering the lot or parking the van. The only time frame that the police could come up with for the killing was that it must have happened between early afternoon, when Eugene called Joanne, and 8:30 p.m., which was when a neighbor had noticed that the Dodge Caravan was no longer parked in the driveway. Within 24 hours of the murder, the news that a prominent MIT scientist and cold fusion advocate had been found dead was making local and national headlines. And it didn't take long before the brutal but straightforward robbery-homicide theory got a lot more complicated. Even as police in New Hampshire interviewed Joanne Malov and her two children, and police in Norwich started tracking down other persons of interest like the Malovs' former tenants, the science community that studied nuclear and cold fusion, as well as other potentially significant alternatives to fossil fuels, began buzzing with rumors and speculation. And the lead detectives on the Malov case were about to get swept up into a high-stakes world of scientific research and intrigue. As police started interviewing Eugene's colleagues and co-workers, his closest friends in the scientific community hinted to police that not everyone would have wanted Eugene to succeed in his quest to discover the secret of cold fusion and a potentially unlimited source of cheap energy. And based on those rumors, and the fact that Eugene's vehicle had been found several miles away with no fingerprints on it anywhere, people began to speculate that this could have been a professional hit or maybe a revenge killing. And these speculations quickly began to appear in the media, with headlines like, "Were those with financial stakes in the big gas and oil companies trying to stop cold fusion research?" Meanwhile, police interviews with the Malov family quickly confirmed that no one in the family had either the motive or opportunity to kill Eugene. But when Joanne told police about the eviction proceedings against Roy and Patricia Anderson that Eugene had been directly involved in, police quickly turned their attention to tracking the former tenants down. Almost immediately, they got a tip from a neighbor who had been friendly with the Andersons that led police to the Andersons' 26-year-old son, Chad Schaefer, who had lived in the house on 119 Salem Turnpike with his parents. And Chad, who was totally shocked at the news of Eugene being found dead, would tell police that he was not directly involved in the eviction proceedings. That was something that Eugene and his parents handled. But his impression was that his parents and Eugene had ended things on relatively good terms. When asked, Chad told police that he had been at his apartment with his girlfriend and newborn baby on the day of the murder. As for his parents, he didn't know for sure where they had been on the day of the murder, but he believed with relative certainty that they had been at their new house in Montville, Connecticut. So police would go to Roy and Patricia's house in Montville, and the couple would be just as shocked by the news about Eugene as their son was, and they would say they were home on the day that Eugene was killed. And when asked about the eviction, Roy and Patricia's story would match their son's. They said that they had not been happy about being evicted, obviously, but ultimately they had managed to end things on fairly good terms with Eugene and his family. And so after the police left the couple's home, they realized that they had no leads. Everything had turned into a dead end. Everyone had an alibi, and no one knew what happened. But soon, the police would catch a huge break, or so they thought. Within days of Eugene's body being discovered, the police actually arrested 2 men for the murder. The men had been on a drug-fueled burglary spree in the Norwich, Connecticut area at the same time that Eugene was killed, and so they seemed like the perfect suspects. But after being held in jail for 4 years, it would turn out the state's forensic lab had actually mishandled a key piece of evidence, falsely linking the 2 burglars to the homicide. While the 2 men would go on to be tried in court for their burglary spree, the state had no choice but to drop the murder charges against them and apologize. But that mistake was much more than just embarrassing for law enforcement. It meant that for the last 4 years that they were focused on the wrong suspects, the police had done nothing for Eugene's murder. They had not investigated anything else. They believed they had their suspects. And so now Eugene's murder was just a cold case. But in November of 2008, which was right after the 2 wrong suspects were released, the state of Connecticut formed a special cold case task force of state and local law enforcement personnel that began aggressively reinvestigating Eugene's murder. 3 months later, they held a press conference announcing that they were now offering a $50,000 reward to anyone from the public who came forward with information that would lead to Eugene's killer. While the task force declined to give any details about their new investigation, Detective Jim Curtis told reporters that during their first 3 months on the case, they had already come up with at least one very promising lead. The news of the possible lead and the $50,000 reward electrified the scientific community. Even researchers and scientists who had disagreed with Eugene about cold fusion had soon realized that his death had left a huge void inside the field of new energy research. And Eugene's friends and his staff at Infinite Energy, who had managed to keep Eugene's publication afloat even after his death, had not only missed him and his brilliant mind, but they also just wanted answers. Who killed Eugene and why? The big new lead that Detective Curtis had referred to during the press conference related to a particular set of keys. On the night of May 14th, 2004, which was the night Eugene was found, the police would immediately notice that the entire property was covered in grass clippings from when Eugene had cut the grass earlier. There were clippings still clumped up on the grass, the clippings were out on the driveway, they had blown into the garage and out into the street in front, and all the litter and debris that was scattered around the property from the cleanout of the house. That too was covered in grass clippings. But there was a set of keys that had a distinctive plastic tag attached to them that had a picture of the sun on it, as well as the name Brittany on the keychain, that were found near Eugene's body, but these keys did not have a single blade of grass on them. Instead, it looked like they were dropped on top of some loose clippings, meaning they had to have been dropped later in the night, well after Eugene had cut the grass. And so maybe these keys were not Eugene's. Maybe they were the killer's keys, and they had accidentally dropped them during the attack. But despite this very promising lead, the police got nowhere with it. Then, roughly 1 year later, in May 2009, a mother of 3 young children, enticed by the $50,000 reward, walked into the Norwich Police Department and announced that she had information about the Eugene Mallove case. The story she would tell police would not only lead them to discover who owned those distinctive keys, but also her story would completely break the murder case wide open, and it would turn out Eugene's murder had nothing to do with cold fusion. Based on what this woman said and the subsequent police investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Eugene Mallove on the evening of May 14, 2004. On the morning of May 14, 2004, Eugene packed his dark green Dodge Caravan with folded-up moving boxes and bags of rags and cleaning supplies, and then he headed south from his home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, to his childhood home 2.5 hours south in Norwich, Connecticut. He wished now that he had made more in-person visits to the property since renting it out a year ago to the Andersons, because not only had the Anderson family stopped paying rent, but they had also stopped treating the property with any respect. When they finally moved out after the mediation and the eviction, the place had become a total eyesore in the neighborhood. At one point, there were 2 non-working cars on the front lawn, and even though the Andersons did remove them when they left, they did not remove all the remaining extra car parts and bike parts that were all over the lawn, and there was just lots of trash and other debris basically strewn across the entire property. And to top it all off, Eugene would learn that the Andersons had been subletting out the basement of the house to help pay their $1,000 a month rent, which had resulted in a steady stream of kind of sketchy people coming in and out of the house that also did not treat the property with respect. And so when Eugene arrived at the house that morning, his plan was just to go in there and throw away anything the Andersons had left behind. After parking in the driveway in front of the dumpster, Eugene took a quick bathroom break inside of the house before going back outside into the garage to start throwing away whatever was inside of there. Over the next couple of hours, as he did this, he periodically glanced out the front doors of the garage up the driveway to Salem Turnpike, where he could see the curious glances from pedestrians and drivers, some of whom slowed down as they passed by the house to see what he was doing. Eugene likely didn't think much of them and just kept doing this big cleanout. However, what Eugene didn't realize was that one of those passerbys was a relative of the Andersons, and they didn't really know the full picture of what was going on. And so when they saw Eugene throwing away all of the Andersons' stuff, the relative pulled out her cell phone and called Patricia and Roy Anderson to tell them what was going on. A few minutes later, as Eugene was peacefully going about his work, across town at an apartment on Chestnut Street, Patricia and Roy's son, 26-year-old Chad Schaefer, and his 24-year-old girlfriend, Candace, heard Chad's phone ringing. He picked it up, but before he could even say hello, he heard his mother's angry voice. She had just gotten the word from that relative that Eugene was at their old rental throwing out the Andersons' belongings, and she was furious. She had been telling Chad for weeks to get over there and clean out the rest of their stuff, but clearly he had not done that. And so now she demanded that her son get over there and take care of this situation. Chad initially did not do anything. But as he sat there, he started to think about what he might have accidentally left behind at the property that now might get thrown away. And so eventually he decided he would head over and talk to Eugene. But before he headed over there, he decided he needed help from his cousin, 31-year-old Mizelle Brown, who was well known to Norwich police and who had a past history of drug offenses. Mizelle arrived out front of the Chestnut Street apartment late that afternoon. On his way out the door of his apartment to go out and meet Mizelle out on the road, Chad grabbed his own set of car keys from a hook and stuffed them into his jacket pocket. A few minutes later, the 2 men were in Mizelle's car driving over to 119 Salem Turnpike. Once they arrived at the house, they turned into the driveway and they parked behind Eugene's van. As the two big men got out of the car and slammed their car doors shut, they saw Eugene step out from behind the back of the house into the driveway, and he was kind of shielding his eyes with his hands, and his face showed no sign that he recognized either of them. The two men wasted no time and walked right up to Eugene and began crowding into his personal space, kind of forcing him to start stepping backwards. But despite how intimidating this was for Eugene, when Mizelle and Chad told him who they were and that he had to stop throwing their stuff out right now, Eugene was immediately defiant and said, "No, you had your chance to claim your stuff, you didn't, now leave." But instead of leaving, Chad stepped forward and threw the first punch in what would become a violent struggle that left Eugene's blood spattered on the side of his childhood home, on the garden hose lying across the backyard, on the doors of the cars parked in the driveway, and on the side of the green dumpster. When Eugene finally fell to the ground face first, Chad and Mizelle took turns beating him literally into the ground with a metal pipe they found on the floor of the garage. Eventually, the two men stopped and just stood there in silence, sweating and breathing heavily while they stared down at the horrible damage they had inflicted on Eugene. Then, almost like snapping back to reality, the two men looked around them to see if anyone had seen them. But when they looked around, it was quiet, and they noticed that where Eugene had fallen, his body was kind of blocked from view by the dumpster and his van and their car, and so no one could even see him, even if they were looking in their direction. And so the two men, satisfied they were in the clear and that they would not get caught, they just casually hopped back into their car, they backed out of the driveway, and they drove back to the apartment on Chestnut Street. When Chad and Mizelle walked through the front door, Chad's girlfriend, Candace, immediately saw their clothes were covered in blood. But before she could absorb what the two men told her, that they had, quote, beat the shit out of their landlord, the two men told Candace that she now had to come with them and help them make their murder look like a robbery. Candace put her newborn baby in the crib, and then she, Chad, and Mizelle left the apartment and returned to 119 Salem Turnpike. But when they got there and they parked in the driveway and approached Eugene's body, Chad and Mizelle were stunned to find that Eugene was still alive. He was still breathing. When they rolled him over, Eugene opened his eyes and looked up at his attackers and began pleading with them to help him as the blood began to spill out of his mouth. As Candace started to back away, Mizelle reached out and caught her by the arm and dragged her back to Eugene's body. And Chad pushed the metal pipe they had used earlier to beat Eugene into Candace's hands. And then Chad pointed at Eugene and said, "Hit him." When she didn't respond, Chad slapped her and said if she didn't do as he told her, they'd kill her too. And so Candace gripped the pipe, she raised it over her head, and as she did this, Eugene begged them to stop. But seconds later, that pipe came crashing down directly onto his face. After she hit him, she handed the pipe back to her boyfriend, and then Chad and Mizelle began taking turns smashing and kicking Eugene's face and body until they were so tired they had to stop. By the end of the second beating, Eugene would have 32 significant lacerations on his face and neck, and a stab wound on his right forearm. But amazingly, at the end of this second beating, Eugene was actually not dead yet. And so with no more energy to use the metal pipe or to kick him, Mizelle Brown, who was a very big guy, just stepped directly onto the front of Eugene's throat and shifted all of his weight to that foot and began digging it into his neck. He would stand there grinding his foot left and right into the scientist's throat, breaking bone and cartilage until finally Eugene stopped squirming and died. After Mizelle climbed off of Eugene's neck, the trio staged the scene to look like a robbery, taking Eugene's wallet, wedding band, watch, and digital camera. Then the men gave the keys to Eugene's van to Candace and told her to drive the van to the parking lot at Foxwoods Casino, where Chad's stepfather worked, and to make sure she wiped any of her fingerprints off of the car steering wheel and door handles. Later that night, after Chad and Mizell picked Candace up at Foxwoods, the three would go back to the Chestnut Street apartment. Before Mizell left, all three of them stripped off their bloody clothes, which Candace bundled into a laundry basket for washing later. Candace stuffed the items they had stolen from Eugene into a box that she shoved into the back of a closet and then later burned. When Norwich police arrived at the Chestnut Street apartment the day after the murder to question Chad about his possible involvement in Eugene's murder, Chad and Candace gave each other alibis, and Chad was highly cooperative, giving police the address of his mom and stepdad. It wouldn't be until later that day that Chad would realize he had dropped his car keys at the scene of the crime. Those were the distinctive keys with the plastic tag and the name Brittany on the keychain that the cold case task force had zeroed in on for not having grass clippings on them. The name Brittany was the name of Chad's daughter from an earlier relationship with an ex-girlfriend. In 2009, when billboards went up around Norwich advertising a $50,000 reward for any information that led to Eugene Malov's killer, Candace's good friend, Jill Sebastian, suddenly felt inclined to talk. So she was the woman who had gone into the Norwich police station and said she had information about the murder. It would turn out Jill had seen that bundle of bloody clothes at Candace's apartment around the time of the murder. Not only would Jill's boyfriend, Keyshawn Delavan, confirm Jill's story, but he also told police that he had personally heard Chad and Mizell boast about beating the Andersons' ex-landlord to death. The couple also told police that Chad and Mizell had been selling crack cocaine out of the Malov rental property, and that when they heard that Eugene was doing a clean-out, they started to worry that he might find some of those drugs in the garage. And so when they went over there, they really needed Eugene to stop. Once police brought Candace in for questioning and offered her a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation, Candace would identify the keys found at the crime scene as belonging to Chad. She also described Mizell's involvement as well as the role she herself had played in the murder. After being entered into the witness protection program along with Jill and Keyshawn, Candace agreed to testify against Chad and Mizell. In 2008, 4 years after Eugene's death, the Malov family house at 119 Salem Turnpike in Norwich, Connecticut, was torn to the ground. 4 years after that, on April 20th, 2012, Chad Schaefer pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and accessory to third-degree robbery and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. 2.5 years after that, on October 24th, 2014, Mizell Brown was sentenced to 58 years in prison. And about 7 months after that, on May 27, 2015, Candace Foster, who served 4 years and 10 months in prison while awaiting trial, pled guilty to hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence and was sentenced to 5 years probation. Back in December of 2004, 7 months after Eugene was killed, the Department of Energy would finally release its report on their review of cold fusion research. While they stopped short of endorsing cold fusion as a viable energy source, they did recommend that funding agencies should entertain individual, well-designed proposals for experiments involving cold fusion. According to a close colleague of Eugene Malov, while the report certainly fell short of what Eugene expected, the colleague believes Eugene still would have welcomed even the smallest steps along a new scientific path into the future. In 2009, 15-year-old Christina Grimmie finally caved and made her own YouTube channel. For years, her friends and family had been begging her to do this because Christina had this incredible singing voice that they wanted the world to hear, but Christina had always been hesitant because she was a bit of an introvert. But that year, Christina was feeling more outgoing, and so she took the plunge, she makes this channel, and in July of that year, she uploads her first 2 songs. They were both cover songs, and she was really proud of them, but when she uploaded them, they didn't get very many views. And so Christina probably was not very excited about making more videos. But a month later, she found herself really enjoying the song Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus, and so she was singing it all the time and humming it all the time, and so finally she said, okay, I'll just film myself covering that song. So she records herself singing this song, she uploads it to her YouTube channel, her 3rd video, and she thinks no one's going to see it because her first 2 videos no one really saw. But this video is different. It went viral almost immediately, and millions of people saw it, and they loved it. Christina couldn't believe it, even though her friends and family had been telling her all along, you have this great voice, you gotta share it with the world. That's different than actually seeing the results of the world saying, you're really great, we love your voice. And so she saw this huge opportunity, and she began uploading more and more music to her channel, and more of her videos went viral. Over the next 4 years, she amassed over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel, she put out her own album, and she even went on tour with the mega celebrity pop star Selena Gomez. In 2014, Christina auditioned for the TV singing competition called The Voice. This show only allows a very small number of contestants who are all incredibly talented musicians. They get screened really aggressively before the competition even starts. But despite the very intense competition she was up against, Christina still managed to finish 3rd overall in this competition. Now, she might have been a little bit let down that she didn't finish 1st, but that show did wonders for her career, because the judges of this competition were mega celebrity musicians, and every time Christina was on TV doing her performance for the competition, the judges would be raving about how talented she was, and that even if she doesn't win this competition, someone's gonna sign her, she's so incredible. And then sure enough, shortly after that competition ended, Christina was signed to a major record label. But despite being considered a star by the masses, Christina still very much viewed herself as being a YouTuber first, which meant despite her mainstream popularity and fame, she continued to upload songs and vlogs to her YouTube channel because she wanted to stay connected to her fans. YouTubers often upload videos that appear very amateur, like not professionally produced. It almost looks like anybody could have picked up their phone and filmed that video. And YouTubers tend to be very candid and show their personality in their videos. And so it makes YouTubers, especially these really popular ones, seem very real and raw and relatable. Unlike traditional celebrities that are kind of outside of society, living in their mansions, living a totally elite and different lifestyle, YouTubers feel like they're your friends. And this was definitely the case with Christina. On her videos, she came off as very humble and gracious and kind and friendly, and so her fans truly adored her. By June of 2016, Christina was still growing in popularity when she was asked to be the opening act for this concert in Orlando, Florida that was happening later that month. She agreed, and then on the day of the concert, which was June 10th, she posted to her social media this kind of shout out to all of her fans saying, hey, if you're in the Orlando, Florida area, come out to my show. And then after the show, I'm going to stick around and sign autographs and meet you guys. That night, the venue where this concert was happening was jam-packed, and most of the people were there for Christina, not the main act. And so Christina, she goes on stage, she has this incredible performance, the main act goes on stage, and then around 10 p.m., the concert ends, at which point Christina comes back out from behind stage and went right out into the crowd and began meeting her fans and hugging them and signing autographs and taking pictures. And then at 10:24 p.m., a man who was a fan of Christina's walked down from the back of the venue and kind of awkwardly gestured that he kind of wanted to get a hug. And Christina saw that, and so she smiled and she walked up to him. She opened her arms to give him a big hug. And when she got just a couple of feet away from him, he drew a pistol and he fired 4 shots into her head and into her body. Christina's brother, Mark, he was standing right nearby and he saw the attack. And so he tackled the shooter and he was trying to get control of this guy. But at some point, the shooter managed to wriggle free. And then he stood up and he kind of walked backwards until he was literally up against this wall, looking at the sea of people that are totally horrified. People are screaming and running and no one knows what he's going to do next. And then the shooter just raises the gun, puts it to his head and pulls the trigger. There were people in the audience who were medically trained who rushed over to Christina and they began performing CPR on her, but there really wasn't anything anyone could do. She would die that night at the hospital. Her killer was a 27-year-old man named Kevin Loibel. He, like many people, had become a Christina superfan. But his infatuation with her became a totally unhealthy obsession. And when it eventually dawned on him that he most likely would never have a romantic relationship with Christina, he came to the conclusion that if I can't have her, no one can have her. And so when Christina put that post out on social media asking people to come to Orlando to see her show and meet her after the show, he took that as an opportunity to go kill her. And so he lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is 120 miles away. And so he sees this post on social media. He grabs his 2 pistols, some extra ammunition. He gets a large hunting knife, and then he calls a cab. The cab drives him 120 miles northeast to Orlando, Florida. And then he gets into the venue with his weaponry because there weren't metal detectors and no one was frisking people as they came inside. And so he was in the back of the venue during the show. And then when it was over, he kind of lingered back, allowing other fans to go up and, kind of mob Christina. And then when there was a lull and there were less people down there with her, he strode right down the aisle and he ended her life. Our next story is called Facebook Post. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother Casey had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single-word note. It just said, "Damages." Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated. And the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off, it jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. The next and final story of today's episode is called Murder Mystery Murder. A little afternoon on Valentine's Day 1998, a married couple named Steve and Kim Rico held hands as they walked towards their car. They had just dropped their 8-year-old daughter off at a neighbor's house in the suburban neighborhood in Maryland where they lived, and now Steve and Kim had the whole weekend to themselves. And they were really excited about it because they had this big trip planned. Now, admittedly, Kim had no idea what they were actually going to be doing because Steve was the one who planned it, and he was obviously being very secretive about the details. He wanted this to be a surprise. And so for weeks leading up to this weekend, Kim would see Steve on the phone all the time, presumably planning whatever it is they were going to be doing, but he wouldn't let Kim hear what he was saying on the phone. He would kind of muffle his voice, or he'd hang up before she could come over and hear him. And then also after these secretive phone calls, Kim would often see Steve writing all these notes down in his journal, presumably about whatever it was he was planning. The only details Steve shared with Kim about this trip was, make sure you wear something nice. When the couple reached their car, Steve hopped in the driver's seat and Kim hopped in the passenger seat, and immediately right after Steve had fired up the car, Kim turned to him and said, "Are you going to tell me? You going to tell me where we're going?" But Steve just grinned and said, "Nope, it's a surprise." Kim gave a theatrical sigh and sat back and feigned frustration, but inside the way she was really feeling was just excited. This was so cool that Steve had put so much effort into whatever it is they were going to do. But also, Kim was seeing her husband was really making a big effort to make her happy. And this was kind of new because lately their relationship had been really rocky. Kim and Steve had been married for 9 years by this point, and they were both very, very different people. Steve was a total homebody, kind of introverted, and Kim was the opposite. She was super extroverted and very social. But when they first met each other, it was actually their stark differences that brought them together. For Kim, when they met, she was in her early 20s, she had just dropped out of college, and her experience with men so far had been she would meet them at parties or bars, and at first it would seem like their relationship was great, but then invariably these guys would just kind of move on and break Kim's heart. But Steve was different. He was this huge guy, 6'4", massive football player, but he was totally a gentle giant. And as soon as he met Kim, Kim could tell this guy is different. He's treating her with respect. He's loyal to her. He really cares about her. And so they hit it off right away. And Kim very quickly became pregnant, at which point Steve asked her to marry him, and Kim didn't hesitate for a second. They were totally in love. And marriage to Steve had really been a stabilizing factor in Kim's life. She wound up going back to college and got her degree, which landed her a job as a surgical technician, which is what she did now. And Steve turned out to be just a fantastic father, and he wound up actually staying home with their daughter when she was a baby so Kim could go out and work. And Kim always thought it was funny when she would come home and she would see Steve standing in the doorway cradling this infant, but he's like this massive person, and so their baby looked like a toy. But unfortunately, over the last year, Kim had seen a change in Steve. He went from being a shy person, but a person who could go out and function in society, to a shy person who basically stopped going outside altogether. Steve basically refused to go out anywhere with Kim. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to spend time with their friends or family. He just wanted to stay home and watch TV or hang out in the basement. I mean, it was pretty obvious he was depressed, but his introvertedness was becoming kind of stifling for Kim. And so Kim approached Steve and said, you really need to go to therapy to get better here. I'll go with you. We can do couples therapy. But Steve refused. And so finally, right around this past New Year, Kim decided she had just had enough. She was totally unhappy. She did not feel like Steve was going to change. And so Kim told Steve that she wanted to get divorced. And when Steve heard that, he realized the gravity of this situation. He knew Kim was unhappy with him, but he did not know she was thinking about separating. And so Steve kind of broke down and begged Kim to give him another chance. Let him prove to her that he will change, that he wants this marriage to work. And Kim said, okay. And so that was how Steve wound up planning this very secret getaway on Valentine's Day. This trip was supposed to be the start of their new and improved marriage, and so Kim was really excited and optimistic about the future. After driving for about an hour and a half, Steve pulled off the highway and began following signs towards the Eastern Shore, which is a waterfront area of Maryland that's very beautiful, that was located about 70 miles away from Steve and Kim's home. After driving for a few minutes, Steve pulled into the parking lot of the Harbortown Golf Resort. And as soon as he pulled into a spot and turned off the car, he clapped his hands and turned to Kim and said, okay, we're here. And Kim looked from her husband out to all the perfectly manicured grounds and the beautiful resort, and she smiled and leapt out of the car excitedly. Kim and Steve took each other's hands and marched inside to check in. And as they were checking in, the person behind the desk gave them glasses of champagne. And then after handing Kim and Steve their key cards, the receptionist told them that their cottage where they were staying was like the nicest property at the resort. Kim and Steve were totally pumped. They took their champagne and their room keys, they walked back to their car, and then drove a little ways deeper into the resort to their cottage. It was cottage 506 and it looked out over the water. And when they went inside, Kim was totally wowed. It was this rustic suite with a wood fire stove in the middle and 2 queen-size beds and a little coffee table area for breakfast over here. It was perfect. And then when Kim actually walked into this cottage, she noticed there was a card sitting on a table, and it looked like a wedding invitation. Kim was confused and looked over at Steve, and Steve just smiled and said, go, check it out. And so Kim walked over and she grabbed the note and she began reading it, and as she did, she began to smile. The card really was a wedding invitation, albeit it was for a fake wedding. Because it would turn out, this was not just a random overnight that Steve had planned for both of them. Instead, he had purchased a romantic getaway package, which included this amazing cottage, but also a professional dinner theater performance that would be held on the resort grounds. Kim read the description of the dinner theater show on this invitation. It was a murder mystery called The Bride Who Cried, where the actors in the show would put on a whole fake wedding, and then at the end of the wedding, somebody would get killed, and the audience would need to figure out who did it. For an extrovert like Kim, an activity like this was perfect. And so Kim felt totally touched that clearly Steve had heard her, and the first thing he did to kind of win her back was to begin to do the things that Kim really wanted to do, which was really going out and having fun. And so after Kim finished reading the card, she turned and looked over at Steve, and Steve was kind of nervous because he wasn't sure if Kim was going to like it. And Kim, she broke into this huge smile. She walked over to Steve and gave him a big hug. And Steve, he was so happy, and he hugged her real tight right back. Kim and Steve would spend the next couple of hours sitting by their fire inside of their nice cottage, drinking their champagne and talking about the future and just telling stories and having a good time. And then around 7 p.m., Steve and Kim put on their nicest clothes and walked their way over to the area on the resort where this dinner theater was going to happen. It was in an event hall with a bunch of round tables set up for the audience. And so once Steve and Kim and the other audience members all took their seats, The actors and actresses came into the room, and they were all dressed in their wedding clothes. There was a bride and a groom and a wedding party, and the audience was instructed to participate in the wedding as if they were wedding guests. And so the audience all stood up, and they began kind of having this fake social hour of meeting all the wedding guests. And then Steve, Kim, and the audience members all took their seats, and they got ready to watch the drama unfold. And Kim, pretty much immediately, was totally absorbed in this performance. She was so enthusiastic, talking to the actors and talking to the other guests, and really pretending like she was part of the wedding. I mean, she was having a blast. The play itself was about a groom who was in the mafia, who was forcing his bride to marry him by threatening her family. The climax came when the groom stood up and gave a toast with his champagne. He took a sip and then fell down dead. Kim watched all of this with delight, but she kept looking over at Steve, hoping he too would be smiling and having a good time. But each time she looked at him, he was just kind of stone-faced and looking straight ahead, like he just didn't care or he was totally disinterested. And then a couple of times when Kim leaned over and said, "Hey, honey, who do you think did it? Who do you think the killer is?" Steve basically just completely ignored her. It was like she wasn't there and the play wasn't there. He was just totally zoned out. Eventually, Kim and a few other very enthusiastic audience members figured out the killer in the play was the bride's mother, who poisoned the groom. And then after this discovery was made, the play was over. As everyone got up from their seats and began to leave, Kim couldn't help but feel really annoyed with Steve because he was just so silent and not invested in this play. And it's like, we came all the way here. Why aren't you at least pretending to enjoy this? But Kim also thought, Steve put a ton of effort into this weekend. He's clearly trying. I'm not going to start a fight. I'm not going to bring it up. And so finally, Kim just said to Steve, "Hey, why don't we go to the bar and get a couple of drinks, bring them back to our cottage, and just hang out there for the night?" And when Steve heard this, he actually smiled and said, "Okay, great, let's do it." And by the time the couple got back to the front door of Cottage 506, they were holding hands again and laughing and telling stories. And they went inside and Steve put the beers down on the table. And then Kim said she was going to go in the bedroom and just quickly change into something more comfortable. And so Kim walked into the bedroom and shut the door. And Steve walked to the front door and turned the lock. Three hours later, a man named Philip Parker, who was staying at the resort with his family, heard a commotion in the lobby. And he heard people saying there might be a fire at Cottage 506 and there could be somebody still inside. Philip immediately turned to his cousin who was with him, and the two of them bolted outside and just started running towards Cottage 506. And as soon as they got to a place where they could see the cottage from a distance, they could see black, oily smoke pouring out of the windows. When they got up to the burning cottage, Philip ran to the front door, but it was locked. He couldn't get inside. He screamed to see if anybody was in there, but there was no answer. And so Philip and the cousin ran around to the back of the cottage where there was a glass sliding door. And Philip, he tried the handle, but it was locked. At this point, the cousin said he was going to run back to the resort and get a fire extinguisher. And after the cousin ran off, Philip turned back towards the sliding glass door and realized it actually opened on both ends. And he had only checked one side and found that side to be locked. But on the other side, which he was now noticing, it was obviously unlocked because it was open just barely. And so Philip immediately opened it up and all the smoke began coming out. And so Philip dropped down to get a better look because down low, the smoke had not fully settled. There was a bit of an air pocket right at the bottom of the floor. And so Philip got down and he looked inside, and for a second he couldn't quite see anything. But then he noticed in the middle of the bedroom, right inside this cottage, he could clearly see somebody's feet. Somebody was on the ground. And so Philip screamed that he was coming in, and then he opened the door the rest of the way and he began low crawling into the bedroom. And as he did, he was hacking and coughing from all the smoke. And so finally Philip reached this person and he grabbed their foot and he shook them to try to wake them up, but they weren't moving. But the fire was getting bigger and stronger. The smoke was getting thicker. Philip was really starting to panic and was worried that he too would get trapped in here. And so he just grabbed this person's leg and began pulling them. And it was really hard, but he finally got this person back to the door. He couldn't quite get them over that lip of where the sliding door was. But right then, Philip's cousin showed up, and the two of them were able to grab this person and get them out of the cottage. And this was the moment when Philip finally got a look at the person he was just dragging out, and it was immediately clear to him that this person was deceased. Their face was basically gone. It was completely burned away. In the days and weeks leading up to this weekend, Steve really was taking secret phone calls and writing notes down in his journal because he was planning something very special. But he was not the only one with plans for this weekend. Here's what police say happened after Kim and Steve got back to their cottage following the show, and Kim went into the bedroom to change, and Steve went to the front door and locked it. A couple of minutes later, Kim came out of the bedroom wearing something sexy, and she looked at Steve and smiled and said, "Come on, get in bed. I'll join you in a second." And so Steve's like, "Great, my plan is working. We're going to reconnect here." He climbed in bed and he laid down. Then Kim, she walked over and got something out of her bag. And then she walked back over to the bed and she pulled out a syringe and she stabbed it into Steve before he could do anything. And she injected him with something called succinylcholine. Kim had access to this drug from her job as a surgical tech. Succinylcholine is used to relax people's muscles during surgery. But if you give someone too big a dose, it can stop their breathing. And this drug works pretty much instantly, which means Steve would have seen his wife stab him with that syringe, but then instantly he would have been totally paralyzed, but fully awake and fully alive. And so as he was laying there, he would have seen his wife put the syringe down and then grabbed lighter fluid and then walked over to him and calmly poured the lighter fluid all over Steve's face and chest. And then one of Steve's final images he likely saw before his lungs stopped working and he died was his wife striking a match and lighting him on fire. After lighting Steve on fire, Kim casually walked out the back sliding door. She shut it, leaving it open just a crack. And then she made her way to the resort lobby where she put on this big act about how her cottage was on fire and she thinks her husband was still inside. And Philip overheard Kim say that her husband might be inside the cottage, which is when he and his cousin jumped into action. They ran to the cottage and ultimately found Steve deceased inside of the cottage. Ultimately, Kim never intended to give Steve a second chance in their marriage. She was already having an affair with a much younger man who was in the Marines, and she was just done with Steve. And so as Steve began telling his friends and family how he was going to make a huge effort to save his marriage, Kim was going around to her friends and literally openly talking about how she wanted to murder her husband. But nobody took her seriously. They thought she was just kind of venting and being kind of dramatic. But as soon as the news broke that Steve had died in this fire and Kim had not, people rushed to the police to tell them, pretty sure Kim had something to do with this. Kim was convicted of her husband's murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. It would turn out the primary reason why Steve was so secretive before going on this trip was he really wanted it to be this unbelievably special, romantic, kind of like recreation of the couple's first date. And so what he was doing is he was calling all of Kim's friends and family members and asking them questions about things Kim liked because he wanted to incorporate all of her interests in this trip. And then after these calls, when Steve was writing in his journal, that was not just writing down like logistics of the trip. He was also writing down how much he loved Kim and how excited he was for their future and what they would build together as a family. I mean, Steve really believed they were on a path to reconciliation. But of course, that just was not the case.